Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Reiki Women Podcast. My name is Michaela Daystar, here with Carrie Varela, and this week we are not joined by Bronwyn Logan because she's actually stateside here from Australia in Chicago teaching some Reiki classes over here. So she's so close to us, not across the ocean anymore, and yet not here on the podcast. So we wish her classes well, and she should be rejoining us next week. So, this week, Carrie and I are going to talk about an experience that is very present for me in this moment, which is what do we experience as Reiki practitioners when we are ourselves ill or sick or injured in some way, somehow not feeling well? I am currently in the depths of a COVID experience, the first round that I've had to experience of this, and it's been interesting to observe myself feeling very sick and um, interacting with my Reiki practice from that perspective. And so I thought that could be an interesting thing for us to talk about. And so I'd love to hear from you, Carrie, just maybe some initial thoughts on, or maybe reflections on your own experience as a Reiki practitioner dealing with illness.
Yeah, I think it's an important topic, right? Because I think there's a tendency within Reiki is to kind of disconnect ourselves from the healing as Reiki practitioners. And so when we're sick, we get a close encounter of what it is to like need the medicine. Need the medicine of healing itself, whether you get it through, of course, Reiki is one possible avenue, but other methods are also, of course, available to us in these modern days. So I think it's always good to, um, reflect on our own experiences first of healing. And so there's this parable that kind of brings it all to mind for me. And the parable is that this man, he goes to the doctor and gets his medicine, and he goes and he takes the medicine and he's waving it down the streets, saying, I got the medicine, I got the medicine. And that he fails to take it himself and he falls on the street dead.
Mm.
And the thing is that we can't disconnect ourselves from healing, and so I think that it's a real lesson in humility to be sick in general, right? But also to really use that as a time to dig deep and use our resources that we have available to us. Of course, Reiki is a huge resource, and when I've been sick, Reiki is something that I'm like, just like, shut the door. I'll see you in a few days. I'm just like, this is Carrie's Reiki time. Um, so I think it's a great, resource to have when we're sick. Um, and one of the ways that it also really helps me is, well, it's kind of surprising how much our mind can go into the process of healing
Mm.
and how big of a factor it is. And I noticed that for myself because I suffer from some chronic pain, low back pain, after I was in a car accident 3 years ago. And, fortunately, I have the method of Reiki to help support me. And unfortunately, hasn't, miraculously healed my low back pain at this stage. Although I'm still hopeful that more healing is available to me in the future. Um, but what I have found is that my mindset is so powerful. And when I get stuck in a cycle of feeling a lot of pain and starting to worry about it and starting to project that sense of pain well into my future, like what am I going to do when I'm 80 years old and feeling this back pain? Like I can see how pain can be very degenerative and accumulating, and so at times I get a little bit lost in this worry and fear around, am I healthy enough, is my body strong enough? Can I withstand these sensations, these uncomfortable sensations, and live my life still, from a place of joy and happiness? And the truth is, sometimes I can get there, sometimes I can't. But when my mind kind of enters that vortex of like what's worry and fear and projection into the future, I know that I'm kind of out of my practice. And so what I found when I've like actually started to just try to reverse the thought process and think positively, like that my body has the ability to regenerate, that this pain will, resolve itself at some point, that I'll find something that really helps, or my body can heal itself naturally. When I enter those kinds of mindsets, I actually feel a whole lot less pain. And so those are some of the, ways in which I think I always try to be really mindful of, my Reiki practice, how it can contribute to my own healing, and to, of course, take the medicine.
Yeah, that last example really shines a light on how much energy we use worrying, right? Like we're diverting energy from our healing process, dwelling on the worry, and then when we can shed that, it actually contributes energy and resources back to what our body needs to do to get us well. And I love the parable that you shared, because I definitely have been that person who doesn't apply the medicine. And I feel like in my life I've practiced Reiki diligently enough over time that I do tend to call on it very readily when I'm feeling emotionally distressed or mentally distressed. Using the breathwork practices and visualizations, and not so much hands-on practice for myself, but using the meditations and visualizations. It comes pretty readily when I feel emotionally distressed, but not when I'm physically ill. And that's something I really had to pay attention to this round. It was a few days in before I was like, let me spend some time in my Reiki practice specifically about this COVID experience that I'm having right now. Um, and it felt, there's frustration around that, right? Like, why didn't I think to do that earlier? I've come so far in having my Reiki practice at my fingertips when I'm emotionally distressed. Why did it take so long when I feel so physically ill? Um, and I'm curious about that. I don't have a good solid answer, but it feels related to um, like when we're feeling physically ill, like there's that desire to like be taken care of, right? To like have somebody else take care of us, to have someone bring us soup and maybe rub our shoulders and like care for us. And I feel like I was in a like feeling sorry for myself mode, because when you're dealing with a communicable disease like COVID, you can't have other people come and help you, right? You have to isolate. And so it was almost like this kind of spiral of isolation, not having anyone to take care of me, that actually caused me to not take care of myself in that way, in other ways, but not in that way. And I'm tracking that. I'm noticing it. I'm not beating myself up over it, but I'm noticing it, and wanting that to be different for myself and for others, in the future, because it is a resource that we have, that we don't want to forsake in our hour of need. And I wish somebody else could come take care of me, right? Like,
Come take care of you and rub your shoulders and give you soup.
yeah, I know, huh?
Because
Definitely.
I don't want COVID. I'm sorry, I don't.
Exactly, right? It's like there's no way around it. You can't. You got to be isolated. I will be scheduling massage as soon as I'm testing negative, though, because man, the body aches, they're real.
Man, well, I had my booster recently, and I had like a day of COVID basically, and I've had COVID previously, and I was just like, oh my God, it's so painful. I think there's this heaviness related to COVID, especially because I feel like when I was sick with it, it was like, oh gosh, not only is this a terrible disease and I feel awful, but some people never recovered from it. And I think that there's this kind of emotional, energetic heaviness, that it was there for me as well. And that really weighed on me too in my healing, and that empathic, um, tug, knowing that so many people have suffered from this, and I'm also in my moment of suffering from it, and it just wears you down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I really appreciate also that you brought up mindsets, and I think that's such an important thing for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about our Reiki practice in its totality, right? Like it can be easy to narrow down what we think about Reiki to, hands-on healing practices, which is an incredibly important aspect of it. Um, but that practice, that element of the system is held within this larger context of where are we focusing our mind, and training ourselves to focus our mind on what matters, on our wholeness, on compassion, on connection, on gratitude, rather than on fear, on anger, on disconnection. um, and so much of what we can experience as healing when we are ill has to do, as you've already said, with our mindsets. And when we think of it that way, for me at least, when I brought into my perspective of what it means to work with healing and with Reiki, it's not just necessarily about curing myself of an illness, but about being with what is present in my life right now, which might be being sick, with a different mindset. I remember early on when I was teaching, one of my students, missed a class, and she called in. She was so sick. She just had some horrible flu or something, and she was very frustrated. She's like, "I'm not supposed to get sick. I do Reiki on myself every day. Like, why did I get sick?" And it threw me a little bit, and I had to think, like, are we supposed to get sick? Is Reiki supposed to prevent you from being sick? Like, what is the relationship between practicing Reiki for myself every day and um, having the capacity to be sick? And I realized that having a mindset that, like, oh, I'm immune from getting sick because I do Reiki, is actually very narrow. It's kind of, but I'm a human with a body in the world. Like, that's going to happen. But how do I approach being sick? What is my mindset when I'm sick? And it's in those times that almost leaning into the precepts and leaning into the breath work has been more valuable for me than doing hands-on work for the physical body, because as you already stated, when we can shift out of fear, when we can shift into gratitude, when we can really be compassionate with ourselves for what we're experiencing, for other people who've gone through the same thing, um, we free up so much energy for the healing process, and we change how we're experiencing it. We learn from the experience. Um, yeah, I'll just pause right there. There was another piece, but I'll just pause right there to see what you've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is so important. And, I've seen it happen. I think myself, I've experienced it. I've seen it happen with other people in different capacities, but there's sometimes this tendency, and I think the only words I could use to describe it is spiritual narcissism, where that's actually a real thing. And I think some psychologists have studied some of the mindsets or the way in which Reiki is described, particularly in Western Reiki, that it can contribute to this sense of spiritual narcissism, that we're somewhat removed from, our service that we're offering other people, the energy that we're offering. And I think that mindset can be destructive, and in the sense that we don't see ourselves as part of the healing process, and don't experience ourselves also in need of healing. And um, to experience our own need for healing is to experience our vulnerability, our humanity, our humanness. And when we're in a place where we're kind of above the healing process, it can happen to almost any healer. It happens to medical people. When we ourselves are sick, it can be a really actually intense, like, psychological moment where we have to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, that we typically serve, perhaps. Um, so I think it's definitely a humbling process, but it's also a good reminder to remember to ourselves that just because you do Reiki doesn't make you immune. It doesn't make you immune to heartache, to loss, to fear, to illness. And I think some people tend to use it like that, unintentionally, perhaps. And that can lead us down a rabbit hole that, it's just not healthy.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not being in right relationship with the practice itself. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciate actually about you. One of the things you mentioned to me is how as Reiki practitioners, if you consider yourself that, I know there's a wide swath of us who listen to this podcast might not necessarily consider ourselves practitioners, but no matter who you are in the practice of Reiki, to come back to the fact that Reiki is first and foremost for yourself.
Mhm.
And then starting from there and then moving outwards. Because if you are a giving person, somebody who, um, maybe identifies as a healer, it's just easy to give of yourself to others, like to put yourself out there, be like, oh, I don't care if you have COVID, I'll come over and from your shoulders, without maybe those appropriate boundaries for your own self-preservation. This is something that we have to work on. This is also our medicine, is to step back into our own role, our own sense of self, and like Carolyn Miss, she says, as long as you have 2 feet on the ground, you are human. And I feel like sometimes in the Reiki culture, there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily consider themselves human.
Yeah.
I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate through a spiritual process to disconnect ourselves from our humanity. And so, lessons around health and healing, they do tend to bring us back into our body, back into our sense of self, and hopefully remind ourselves that, you know, we need it too.
Yeah. Hey, I appreciate you bringing up humility and the kind of opposite side of that with the spiritual narcissism. Um, it feels related to an experience I had, in this bout of sickness. We talk often on this podcast about the Japanese roots of Reiki and the Buddhist and Shinto roots of Reiki and some of the concepts that are important in the practice of Reiki, and the subjects of non-attachment and of interconnection are really important key pieces. And I had a humbling experience with that 2 days ago, when I was, especially sick, like the worst that I felt. I realized at a certain point that part of what was contributing to feeling so bad was that I had gotten very attached to my identity as somebody who had not had COVID. Like I had developed this like pride as like I have survived the pandemic and I have made it out without being sick. And I wasn't even really aware of this necessarily, but I had developed this pride and this almost belief that like I'm gonna not get sick. I'm gonna make it through. Everybody else is gonna get sick. I'm not gonna get sick. Um, and after going on 3 years of this, I hadn't yet gotten sick, and so here I am sick, feeling absolutely miserable, the worst I've felt, and I can't even remember how long, and I'm dwelling on this like loss of this identity as the survivor of the pandemic, and like when I realized that it was like kind of laughable, right? That I was so attached to that identity that I was making myself even more miserable because I had to let go of it. And, as you said, that shift in mindset when I was like, okay, yeah, you got to let that go. Like, that wasn't a realistic expectation, first of all. And secondly, it's not a big deal. Let it go. And once that happened, as you said, freed up energy. The next day, I felt a lot better. And the next day, I was able to, kind of free of that attachment, I was able to feel quite a bit more connection and empathy with everybody else who's had to go through this, right? It's like up till this time, I've had sympathy and I have, had compassion for people who had this illness, but there was a certain, empathy, there was a certain connection that I felt detached from, like perhaps as you were saying, removed, from the healing, that, I get to experience now. Um, and that was humbling and, felt like it felt like something positive to hold on to as I was starting to feel better. But I did have to laugh at myself for that attachment to that identity.
Well, I mean, I think it's understandable, and I think sometimes too when we're in pain, it can bring up and dig up some emotions that might not be comfortable at all, whether it be that mindset shift that there's some attachment that you had to let go of. But other times I found that, even like through tattooing or other ways in which, might, and through chronic pain, been, in pain, had momentary experiences of pain, and in that process, like there's like these really deep emotions that I've not wanted to feel. They come up, and they're kind of gnarly, and I am put into a place when you're not even feeling well. It's like also be processing something which feels deep and dark and intense. And so even though in COVID we do have to isolate, I hope you don't feel alone, and I hope other people who might be listening remember that no matter how isolated we feel, it's so important to reach out and feel supported in times
Absolutely.
of stress.
What do you recommend for folks who have that experience of, being in some sort of physical pain or distress and having those deep emotions come up in response? And now you're dealing with both of those things, the physical pain and the emotional pain. Is there anything that you, in particular, find helpful or that you would recommend folks, perhaps who either are practitioners or who aren't, that can maybe navigate that experience?
Good question. I mean, more Reiki is one thing that I could say. I think also something that's really important is just to journal and or find some other way to kind of emote or express or get that emotion out of your inner experience and more into an outer experience. But being really careful, we know it when we're in a state of emotional distress, but trying not to act on that emotional distress while we're in a state of emotional distress, because in my experience that usually only leads to more emotional distress and confusion and drawing more people into your own personal drama. So doing your best, trying not to act up on those feelings or thoughts until you kind of can come to it from a more well-rounded place. Those are things that tend to help me. Moving my body, doing something positive for myself, um, you know, enjoying a nice meal, or really trying to take pleasure from the little things in life, like a cup of tea, or, you know, um, being with my kids, all of those things. I think those things really tend to help me, being in nature. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a great list. And I love how, everything that you've named um, gives room for whatever you're experiencing and then also helps to redirect the focus um, onto something pleasurable, something nourishing, something life-giving. Um, and I would add that, just to kind of bring in our Reiki practice, that working with the precepts in those sorts of situations has been really helpful for me, particularly the precepts around fear and compassion. And sometimes that looks like journaling, just kind of stream of consciousness, just for today, I fear not. And then whatever I'm afraid of comes out, or doing that just in my mind, um, giving myself, some just loving touch, whether or not it's specifically Reiki, but doing that while really working through how am I relating to my fear, and then how am I relating to my self compassion inside of whatever this difficult experience is. It's a very simple thing to do, but if we really kind of give our attention over to it, it can be um, very powerful in shifting what we're experiencing. Um, so yeah, I think that's what I would offer.
I love that. And I think one other thing I guess I could mention too is that okay, well, so this is interesting, and we've talked about combining Reiki with other things before, but there's this concept in Kundalini yoga, and I was listening and reading more about this from this man named BNS Iyengar, who's one of the last remaining students of Krishnamacharya. He's in his 90s now. He's um, quite elderly, but is this wonderful Indian man who has this wealth of knowledge. from his culture and from his lineage. But he was talking about the idea of Kundalini rising, and the idea of Kundalini rising. He said that a lot of times it gets stuck in our throat, and it
Mm.
doesn't go all the way up through our head and through our crown. And I think of that as also this process too that we have to lean into as healers or speakers or teachers. Is that sometimes we're used to being the one who gives the advice, gives the thoughts, and in that process sometimes it emotes it or releases those thoughts or that practice out to others, but we kind of leave ourselves out of that process. And I know I can do that sometimes, like teaching yoga. I might teach a concept, but I'm not really thinking about how it's applicable for me. I'm thinking about how it's applicable for other people, you know? So that process can get stuck here, and then I extend it out, but it's not coming up into my consciousness. It's not coming into my mind. And one of the biggest benefits I think of being, having Reiki in our lives, is that we can give ourselves this enter this state of receptivity.
Mhm.
And it is, I think, hard for me, and I would assume others, but I'll just speak for myself that it's hard for me because I'm a giving kind of person, to get and to feel comfortable with receiving. And that's really what I think happens when I can really get into my own healing space, is to enter a deeper state of receptivity and feeling safe to do that. And I know recently I had a really bad headache, and I could have just spent this like time kind of like keeled over, like,
Mhm.
pressing my head or whatever. But instead, I decided, let's do that. Let me relax. Let me kind of call in Reiki. Let me do some hands-on healing and be really intentional and ask that intention, send that intention out. And it totally dissolved my headache, like almost immediately. And I was like, that's so great. So anyways, I think we have a lot of resources at our fingertips. A lot of intuition also to lean into our body's wisdom, but it is really hard when you're sick to actually get into that wise wisdom place.
Well, that feels like a really sweet note to end on, that, reminder for us to be willing to receive, whether it's receiving from our own self or from other people, to really give ourselves the care that we need in whatever the situation that we're in. Um, So we would love to hear from you, dear listener, about your experiences with illness and healing. Have you had an experience where you felt your mindset shift around your experience of being sick, of being hurt? And what was that like? We would love to hear from you. If you feel like this topic would be supportive for anybody else in your life, please do share this around. And that is the best way that you can help to spread these conversations to a wider audience. And we will be back with you next week. Hopefully, we'll have Bronwyn with us at that time, and we'll be in for another great conversation. Well, thanks so much, Carrie.
Thank you, Michaela. I hope you feel better.
I will. All right, friends. Till next time. We love you. Bye.
Bye.